Hey, everybody, this is Joe Turner. I want to give a quick little introduction into this interview because this is part one of my three-part series with Tim Nowak. He is a fire EMS expert. If you do not remember, I interviewed him way back in episode 40 when we talked about the impending crisis in fire EMS service across the country. Now, my goal with every episode is to provide direct value to the city managers, the county managers, and whatnot who are listening. But this is going to be a little bit different, okay? Because while I think you're going to get value from this episode, I kind of wanted to flip the script a little bit and help you with this series of interviews with Tim to help educate and communicate key issues about fire EMS, not only to your local elected officials, but to members in your community. And so, what I'm hoping is that this interview with Tim will serve a little bit as a primer to give these individuals, these elected officials, these residents, a foundational understanding of the macro level, 30,000-foot level of fire EMS in your community. And so what I'm hoping is that you can turn your residents on to these episodes if you are having some fire EMS discussions in your community, or you feel like you need to start having these discussions within your community. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to release these episodes consecutively or if there will be a gap in between. So just heads up on that. But part one is going to be a conversation about the different organizational and operational models in the fire EMS space. Episode two is going to talk about staffing and deployment of these resources. Now, the third and final installment of this interview series will be all about conducting a needs assessment for your community, when and where you might want to consider doing a needs assessment, what intervals, and what have you. For full disclosure, Tim Nowak has not compensated me for this interview series. I am not being paid in any way, shape, or fashion. This is just information I wanted to share with you all that I think might be valuable, not only to you directly as a city manager in terms of helping you better understand fire EMS, but primarily to help you communicate this information to different stakeholders and individuals within your community. All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. And with me today is Tim Nowak. He is an fire EMS consultant, and he was on our program before in the past. It was a really good episode, had a lot of great feedback on it. One of our better listened episodes with some just phenomenal comments, Tim. Welcome back to the program. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself to the audience and let them know how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, Joe, thanks again. I really appreciate being here. This is a lot of fun. Podcasting is fun in general, and the outreach, the comments, the follow up, and the feedback from the last episode, I think was great. Had a number of great conversations on the side, and even a couple of projects that resulted out of that, which really just speaks to the testament of the reality of where some of the fire and EMS industry is and what's coming up. Recapping really quickly and giving just a quick highlight of myself. Tim Nowak, again, pleasure to be a repeat offender on the show. I'm a fire and EMS consultant, firefighter, paramedic by trade with chief officer experience. I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin, actually started my career here. I transitioned to the other side of the state and worked in the Minnesota border for a little bit, then moved to Colorado and worked in the Denver area, lived in Colorado Springs, went to Florida and was a chief officer for a county-based EMS agency there. Moved back to Wisconsin once I got into full-time consulting, but then also have side work that I do at least with content writing. I've written and published over 200 different articles on EMS platforms on the online side, as well as some printed published magazines. I was an editor in chief of an EMS magazine called the EMS Director, and had a large subscription base with that, online continued education, you name it. So if there's something to do with EMS especially, and even on the fire side, I probably have had my hand in it in some way, shape, or form over the
You're
past
the
20
man.
years. Yeah, I
You're
like
the
to think
man.
so, at least a growing influence. And then there's LinkedIn, which is just a phenomenal network in itself. I've got a strong following there with regular engagement with thought leaders and administrators throughout the country, and a growing network of city administrators too. So I appreciate that.
So, in our pre-interview call, we talked about the first episode, and you said you had roughly a dozen solid inquiries from potential clients and customers, and that led to about two or three different projects you've been working on since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And between myself and some other team members tackling those projects, it's been a great turnout and great discussion. Helping small departments, especially, is where we're seeing a lot of need and a lot of drive for some of the business just to build in, but certainly not opposed to, I mean, large communities, counties, even states with projects as well. So I think even the discussion today hopefully will help to provide some clarity for everyone and just some understanding and realization of you don't know what you don't know, and I don't expect you to know what you don't know. So let me come in and at least give you some insight.
And I'll put your contact information in the show notes, Tim, so people can get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your services and offerings. I kind of put this out there for the audience. In our first episode, we talked about the coming crisis or impending crisis in fire EMS service throughout the country. And what we're going to do on this episode, or and this might actually turn into a series of episodes, not sure how this is going to play out, but we are going to unpack, sort of provide a primer for those who want to know more about fire EMS in general. So imagine you're a city manager listening to this podcast right now, and you're going through some tough times with your fire EMS service, right? And it's a very complicated subject to unpack for the average person, right? So what we want to do is really kind of get into the nitty gritty of it all and unpack it and almost put the primer together so that citizens and local, elected officials and staff, they can kind of get a really good idea of all the different aspects or pieces of the puzzle that go into the equation when trying to figure out how to navigate this really complex and difficult topic of fire EMS service, and how do we provide it in an era when resources seem to be dwindling and demands seem to be increasing to an unsustainable rate of service and compliance, right? So, Tim, based off the outline you give me, we're going to talk about organizational models, operational models, staffing, deployment, and then we're going to wrap it up with a needs assessment. So, does that sound pretty on track with what you want to cover as far as laying this out for the folks who are listening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's important about this discussion is that no one community or county or taxing district or jurisdiction of any sort is immune from anything that we're going to break apart today. Looking at just national headlines, you take a metropolis like Fort Worth and the whole Dallas Fort Worth area, and they're undergoing an active transition, taking apart a public utility type model of agency and transitioning it toward a fire-based system. And that is that's a massive undertaking, and they're doing it. I think about a lot of the mid-range, large within this context of many states, but like mid-range communities where the population's like 70,000 to 120,000. There's a lot of potential there. And then you take the smaller communities, the 25,000s and less, and there's different dynamics too. And every single one of them, I'm seeing, the feasibility, the possibility of transition or changes coming about with each of those. And it's very unique, it's very dynamic. Of course, there's differences when you look at the geographic locations of, every community throughout the country. There are certainly trends that are there, but not a single community is immune from this discussion. And volatility or the potential for it, or on the flip side, the potential for massive optimization and efficiency really is there with just about everyone. And that's not to say that everyone needs to change or consider it, but at least being aware of what's out there and having some baseline information of, if you are going to consider a change, what do you need to look for. That's what we can take apart here.
So, Tim, let's unpack this the show by beginning with the organizational models. And according to the notes you've given me for the outline structure for the interview, you identify three primary organizational models that are currently existing in the United States. The first is the public model. That's what we classically understand to be a city or a county agency collecting taxes, staffing up an agency that then goes and out and responds to either fires or medical calls. Then you have the private model. There's a for-profit and a nonprofit component to that. That's a pretty interesting discussion that I think we can unpack, because nonprofit has multiple meetings within the public service domain of EMS services, for example, and for fire departments. And then we have the hybrid model, which is something I'm not really super familiar with, but that's a franchise slash enterprise model. And so, won't we get into discussion with the organizational models, and you can unpack that for the audience so they can get a better understanding.
Yeah, so the organizational models and really breaking those down to start with, I would say for one, all of them apply to you as the municipal executive, whether it's a city level, county level, special taxing district. They all apply to you in some way, shape, or form because either you oversee them, or your mayor or council or someone does, or you're on a board, or you're contracting with one of these entities. So looking at public, which probably is the one that's most near and dear to all of your hearts within this industry because it's part of your line item and your general funding. On the public side, there's a difference between fire departments, ambulance services, or combinations of them that are city or county run, but also the new kid on the block that's gaining a lot more popularity not only in the western states, but moving Midwest and slowly creeping its way east, is actually the implementation of special taxing districts specific to fire and/or EMS. And it really creates a unique public utility type of model that, much like school districts and water utility and others, allows for somewhat of that separation from municipal government. I don't want anyone to throw anything at me for saying, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. There's pluses and minuses to it. But what's unique, at least on the fire and EMS side, there's a positive there from, now you're no longer part of the general fund. You're separated. When you need to get more funding for something, at least you would think it'd be easier to levy tax and get a referendum or a vote specific for the fire department or specific for ambulance services. That stuff's usually a little bit easier and a little bit more sexy than, you know, roads and streets and
A
whatever
general
repair.
tax, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So at least the public knows it's going straight for this. Of course, fire, EMS, police, I'm going to pay for it.
Why do you think that the special tax district model is gaining steam? We talked about this a little bit in our very first interview where we talked about the pressures and challenges facing fire and EMS services across the country. So it's gonna be a little bit repetitive, but if you haven't listened to the first episode and you're joining us now, why would you say that the special taxing district is gaining steam when it comes to this way of having an organizational model?
Yeah, no, excellent question. And I would say the answer there is consolidation or regionalization or whatever you want to call it. There's so much fragmentation and siloing within my industry, especially eastern states. It's much more prevalent and common, but there's so much fragmentation. The solution really here in many situations, not all, but in many, many situations, is the need to have less agencies, less departments, not saying less people or less apparatus or vehicles, but less departments in order to create that actual system, the economy of scale, a consolidated or regionalized structure. And so once we start doing this, I would imagine you would probably agree that there's politics when one community gets involved against another community. Someone thinks that we should have control, we should have control, we don't want to have that place in control, and so there's this local control element that just plagues these consolidated efforts, and it happens within my industry and the department. So I'm not just casting all the blame or throwing stones at you guys, but it exists, and in
Right,
some
right.
situations it just damages the entire transaction and the potential for what could be. So where the taxing district at least comes into play is it seems to at least put everyone at a little bit more of an equal playing field as far as representation, and allows for the service to exist regardless of municipal affiliation.
So it's interesting. My first city administrator gig was in a small town. We didn't have our own EMS department. We actually contracted out to a nearby city, and it was very frustrating because I had members of my governing body who felt that our contract was not a very fair contract and that we were somehow paying more than we should, or and what have you. And there was a desire to have our own EMS department to have supposedly better response times, but it's very challenging to be in a small community and stand up your own EMS department.
So what's going on is, for those who are just tuning into this episode and didn't catch the first one, is you're having all these pressures and forces that are conspiring against especially smaller communities with their EMS departments. And what you're seeing is, going to back to what just Tim just said, is as we're going into this more of a consolidation model where more than one entity or organization or agency are getting together and combining forces, they're creating these special tax districts to sort of create, I think, more accountability and transparency and fairness within the whole process, and organized agreements and so forth and so on. Is that pretty much the simplistic answer on that?
Yeah, and like in the situation where you mentioned, with your community contracting with a private provider, and that's not always the case. Sometimes it's contracting with another municipality nearby.
That's what we were doing.
Yeah,
We were
yeah.
contracted with another municipality. Yeah, yeah.
So two options as far as the contracting route that are very common. And with that, I can recall reading something locally where a department I worked for was taking over and consolidating or merging in a nearby community. And the quote from the fire chief, right in the paper, I remember it, was, "You're getting what you pay for." With and quoted that and said that with respect to, well, what will this township or village get out of this equation? We still have our identity? And it was just, no, you're becoming us, so you're getting what you pay for. And for some people that doesn't sit well.
Well, and it's also, if you read between the lines, depending on the perspective and the person who's saying it, getting what you pay for can sometimes mean that, well, if you're a small city and you're basically coming to us for help, and we are the big city that's offering you the help, then you're just going to kind of get our leftovers and what we can give you. You're not our first priority, because our first priority is going to be taking care of our own community type thing, right? And this leads into a lot of debate and
Yeah,
frustration discussions, and some people feel like they're getting the shaft, whether they are or not. It can become a very divisive situation with a lot of rhetoric, obviously.
absolutely. In those environments, that's where the special taxing district model is seen to thrive, is because then it helps to separate out my community versus yours within that respect. It seems less volatile with political relationships.
And so you see the special taxing district model accelerating as far as towards adoption, especially when we talked about in our first episode, a lot of those East Coast sort of jurisdictions. They have a lot of fiefdoms, and it's a lot of territorial battles. But there's a lot of these communities that are served by more than one department, so there's a lot of waste and overlap when it comes to administration. So I think you believe that the special taxing district model is going to become much more popular as time goes on, correct? Just by necessity.
Yeah, I really think it does. And it applies for any one of those communities where if you're 50,000 population and less, or if you're bordering up against a bunch of small, suburban communities or rural markets, the taxing district likely is the safest way to go.
So let's talk about the private model now, because when I think about the private model, my first immediate reaction is on EMS. Are there private fire departments in this country? Because I don't ever think of or know of any private for-profit fire departments. I know of, obviously, private for-profit EMS services, ambulance services, and what have you. But can you unpack the difference on the private nonprofit and private for-profit model when it comes to fire and EMS?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Private in the EMS industry is much more common, both for profit and nonprofit. Sometimes the nonprofits are, hospital affiliated. Sometimes it's a combination of. I worked with one organization, did a study for them where it was actually three communities that essentially created a 501(c)(3), and the three communities, sat on the board. And their question was, should we keep it as is or should we go public? There, as you can imagine, one community didn't want to necessarily have the other one in charge or contract to them. So the ending recommendation was stay as is. However, strongly consider the taxing district model. And for them, the premise there was that consider the taxing district model with the intent of greater expansion, and then eventually, transitioning their people toward public benefits rather than private benefits. But it is a very sustainable model. Where it's very, very common is in the rural environments, especially Midwest. I see quite a bit of this, where the ambulance services are nonprofits, and sometimes again with municipal tag of sorts, where the city or the town council or whatever may be a part of the board. So that still is very, very common. In bigger cities, nonprofit ambulances are typically hospital oriented or associated.
Right.
Not a guarantee,
Yep.
but common. Uh, Private for profit Typically, they follow the money because they are a business model. And not to say anything bad about it, but they're a business model because they have to make money and don't have the same deduction benefits and whatnot of others. So they typically are in the bigger cities and want to make sure they have at least either a 911, but also an interfacility transfer market. So taking a patient from hospital A to hospital B, or from the hospital to nursing home, or nursing home to home, or whatever the combination would be, going between places to add up, have more billables.
So you're not going to see a for-profit EMS model in a small rural type community, generally speaking, right?
Typically not. Very, man, incredibly uncommon if it does exist. And in
Right.
fact, more of the private for-profits, if they're not serving a population base of, I'm kind of anecdotally saying 100,000, if they're not serving a population base of, 100,000, something at least in a big number, man, it's a tough market for them to make it. Super, super tough. So there's even risk, some of the one of the largest private for profits right now is even backing out of some markets just because they're not able to make all the ends meet, and without municipal funding to support the 911 services, which kind of drag them down because the return on investment, the money isn't as beneficial as the interfacility market. They're having to fold up and walk away and turn down contracts for the future just because they can't do it without the additional funding. So yeah, EMS side, very common. On the fire side, yeah, you're right. Private for profit is incredibly less than 1% common. There was, and I guess still kind of is, one major player, and I think it's only like in Arizona, maybe one other state, but like in Arizona is the only one I can think of where there's a decent sized private for profit. Arizona, maybe Utah, but in that western kind of area.
How are they making money? What's the angle there? Because that's so bizarre to me. I never.
Yeah, so they're making it off of billing or a contract for service with the community. So in lieu of them having their own agency, they're paying for it there. I would imagine they probably also have some sort of a fee structure for billing businesses directly for like fire inspections or other types of inspections.
Got you. Okay.
I'm presuming at least that's part of the market.
Yeah, to have sort of like the reoccurring revenue coming in, and yeah, okay, I got you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously when it comes to having the conversation about the nonprofit model, we talked about, having like a board, a nonprofit will have a board and provide the oversight and what have you, and maybe it's split between, multiple members of both communities or multiple communities or what have you. Getting back to the tax district model, who's providing the oversight in those situations?
Yeah, so typically there, the bylaws, the structure of the organization is oftentimes municipally driven. So each of the communities that is a player or a payer in the game has, either an equal vote or some sort of an equitable type of vote, based off of population or something served.
Right.
So yeah, usually there's a representative from each municipality, whether it's administrator or someone that they assign or designate to it. But commonly, each playing or participating municipality has some sort of representation. So they still get to have that say, and more from the equal standpoint. And then you throw in some at will or ad hoc representatives that maybe that are elected in or something.
Right.
There's different
Or
structures.
citizen oversight
Yeah.
of some
Yep.
kind or what? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Now, let's unpack the nonprofit aspect a little bit because nonprofit, I know because you talked to me earlier in the beginning of the episode about how your LinkedIn presence, and I follow you on LinkedIn because you have a very strong following there. Just like I have my niche with the city manager, public sector executive market, you have a great following within your niche in the fire EMS community. And something you talk about quite frequently is confusion over what nonprofit truly means, or volunteer, I should say. And so, for example, in my small community, it was a quote unquote volunteer firefighting department, but we paid them on a per call basis and they got W-2s at the end of the year and what have you. What you would say is, hey, that's not really a volunteer fire department, right? It might be nonprofit. But once you unpack a little bit more as far as the nonprofit versus the volunteer and the different types of volunteer slash nonprofit.
Yeah, the term volunteer is largely undefined, different, variable, gray, confusing, and even contentious, no matter where you go. Each state is different.
Right, because in conventional understanding is that a volunteer is somebody who literally volunteers and does something without any financial
Yeah.
compensation whatsoever, right? Maybe they have an expense, maybe they're driving to do something and they get a mileage reimbursement or something like that, or they go to the store to buy something for the nonprofit, they get reimbursed for that purchase. But as far as their time, is basically donated to the organization or whatever it's volunteered. And then you go into some small communities and they use the term volunteer
Yeah.
firefighter. But those firefighters don't necessarily work for free, although I think some do. I think some are truly volunteers depending on where we're at in the equation. So it is really kind of
Yeah, and
murky.
it comes down to just a pride sentiment. And it's one of those things where, so my advice to all of you as municipal executives would be, leave it alone. Don't try to engage in the conversation of fighting. Let me try to tell someone they're not a volunteer, but if you try telling them that, man, you're gonna be just peeing on an anthill and it's not going to be good. I think the important thing for this audience to really understand, though, is where can you get in trouble? Where's the risk with this? And it's going to be in taxes. And if these people are indeed paid more than whatever IRS, allowance is going to be, and more than just uniform replacement and whatnot, if they're paid to be on call or to respond, then they are employees. They are not volunteers. They are employees. And that means, W 2s, there should not be 1099s within this industry. Now, I'll preface and say that I am not a tax lawyer, but every bit of information and the insight I've received has been toward that advice that we are W 2 employees. We are not 1099 contractors. There's rules and stipulations, and therefore, not contractors. But at any rate, keep your community safe. These are, at the end of the day, employees. There needs to be rules, regulations. They have to follow, what's there. And just because you're a volunteer, and what I, say to the EMTs and whoever in the EMS market is that just because you're a volunteer doesn't mean that all of a sudden, okay, you know what? This person's got chest pain. So, okay, you're only a volunteer. Now the standard of care and the requirement of care is different because you're just an EMT or you're just a volunteer. And no, that's not the case at all. Chest pain is chest pain, whether you're a volunteer, career, part time, or any combination of something in between there. It doesn't matter. So there are standards, there are expectations, and if you don't want to meet those, thanks for playing, but this is the expectation now. And what's going to be very interesting is OSHA is in the middle right now of some rule revisions and some language change up that could drastically impact the requirements of fire departments and even EMS agencies. The standard is related to fire brigades, but they're expanding that into more emergency services now, and it could drastically impact the requirements, both on the physical side, PPE and safety and protection and whatnot, and just different types of standards out there. So more to come with that one. It's in public review right now, and I'm trying to read through the massive document that exists. There's a lot to digest, and there's, I think, pretty significant risk of actually some, volunteer small rural departments having a massive drop in numbers just because people will not qualify or they just won't want to meet the
Right.
standard.
And I'm not trying to hate on OSHA, but I think we all know that anytime OSHA is going to get involved with something, it's not going to be helping, or whatever they're trying to do is not going to be easy for a small rural district that's already struggling with staffing and volunteers or people who want to help out and resources. It's not going to make it easier for those folks to operate a department. I think that's pretty safe to say. But, kind of circling back to what you said a minute ago, don't want to get into any flame wars with anybody about volunteers versus employee firefighters or anything like that. Obviously we want to respect anybody who is willing to show up and answer the call for service. And I'm not sitting here trying to suggest that because a quote unquote volunteer gets paid to respond to a call that they are not doing great work and they're not contributing to their community whatsoever. That's not what I'm trying to. I'm not trying to disparage that involvement or that work at all, because frankly they don't get paid enough in my opinion. I mean, you're talking about in small town Kansas, you got individuals who are getting paid $20 or $15 to respond to a call at 2 o'clock in the morning. So what I mean? So I'm not in any way trying to disparage volunteers. What we're trying to simply say is that we sometimes throw around the word volunteer very nonchalantly in this profession or in local government when it's really not a true representation of what the responsibilities are with respect to how that organization's operating and what they are owed or what they're required to do with respect to those individuals that are responding to those calls. Correct, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. This is in no way, shape, or form, a slam on any of those people. It's an absolutely warranted and needed group, but
Yeah.
but having
We'd be lost
yeah,
without them. I mean, like you said, we'd crumble. Or I hate to say it, if we go back to the first episode that we had, but we talked about one of the reasons why the crisis that is coming in fire EMS is because we have so many folks who are not answering the
mhm,
call when it comes to quote unquote volunteering for their local department. So, I want to be 100% clear: we are not disparaging volunteers in any shape or form. We're not disparaging anybody who responds to calls. It's just that issue is that local governments can find themselves in trouble if they are not truly understanding what they are legally required to do in the context of caring for these first responders.
exactly, and especially if they are part of your oversight, part of one of your departments, you got to make sure that you're meeting your regulations, IRS and reporting and payment and all that stuff appropriately. And what's always unique or challenging, and the numbers of volunteers are declining. The model in itself is massively declining. And in many areas, I think it's even a dying model to where give it another 5 years and it's not going to exist. Many of these departments might have a roster of 20 people, but the reality is that 25% of that roster actually runs, maintains. So if you're lucky, and that is significantly problematic. Now, luckily, the only thing that saves many of them is the fact that the N is so low. The amount of calls is so low that luckily nothing bad has happened. But if or when it does, man, problems. So key points with volunteers is make sure that whatever you're doing from the financial reporting side, if they are paid, they are not volunteers, they're employees. And talk with legal counsel and all that fun stuff too. Think of it this way: do you have volunteer police officers? How about volunteer nurses at hospitals? And if you don't, then why the hell are we having volunteer EMTs and firefighters and whatnot? And that can transition into the different types of models because there are solutions, there are possibilities of fire and EMS combining, and that's not always the solution, but in some areas it's a wonderful idea.
Right. Let's come back to that in a second, Tim.
Absolutely.
Let's finish up the organizational models by talking about the hybrid. So, can you unpack the hybrid model for the audience?
Yeah, so hybrid models are not incredibly common. I'm seeing them more in larger communities where a municipality, in a sense, owns the agency, but contracts in with a private provider to run it, to do it. So even like the employees are employees of the private agency. They're just running under typically this, DBA, doing business, whatever branded type of name of sorts. And it's weird because it's kind of like it's quasi public, but it's not. And what gets challenging is like on the ambulance side for billing, who does the billing? Does the billing come from that private vendor or does it come from the municipality? Because that can actually really change the dynamic of what the recovery is, especially in some states that have like supplemental payment programs or ground emergency medical transport programs for Medicaid money in the state. You may become eligible or may not as a result of it. So again, those hybrid models, it's kind of like an enterprise of sort where it's on paper a city organization that is contractually run and performed by a vendor, and it's really, I don't know, it gets kind of messy. Gives me a little bit of chest pain. They're not common. They are out there typically with bigger, metropolitan type of areas, but they are out there. It's unique. So I'm thinking of like Aurora, Colorado is kind of in this market. Pinellas County, Florida is in that kind of market as well. And they're different. They're unique. There's different rules and it's a different game.
Okay. So if we're going to sum this up for the audience, for those who are listening, if you got some, just some average citizens who are wanting to know more about their fire EMS, obviously the public model is going to be the dominant one as far as the city county agencies that are standing it up with traditional property tax dollars from the general fund and other revenue sources, with the special taxing district becoming much more common, and you see that trend accelerating into the future. And then on the private model, we're going to see that far more often with EMS departments, standalone EMS departments, or ambulance services. And then the hybrid model is something that is relatively rare in the grand scheme of things. And you don't see that really changing any way in the near future. Right? Just basically to stay status quo.
Yeah, status quo, or even transitioning more toward the public completely oversight. And that would be presuming that some of those private entities would actually start to fail or flop, which
Okay.
there's a risk. I don't know how strong the risk is right now, but it's there. It's a weird setup.
So let's go to the operational models now. You kind of teased it a little bit there a minute ago. Right now, there's two main operational models, as far as I understand it, based off the notes you've given me. That is the combined fire/slash EMS department, and then you have the separated standalone fire EMS departments. And where do we stand right now? What is more common, or what are the hallmarks of, say, a standalone agency? Are those usually in larger communities or certain regions? Can you just sort of unpack the characteristics of how prevalent each one of those models are and why or where they're prevalent?
Yeah, so without stats in front of me, I would say anecdotally at least that they're more common separate, but that's only accounting for, East Coast, for example, there's significantly more fire departments than there are ambulance services, and many of them are volunteerish in nature and separated. So there's different trends, I think, with population. And I think population is kind of the key factor here. And I think there's a sweet spot for the combination, but then also the separation of the two. So fire and EMS being two different disciplines. Now, even some states you get kind of weird, like Michigan has this public safety model where it's fire and police. There's two agencies in Wisconsin which are actually fire, police, and ambulance. I don't want to get into my personal thoughts on either one of those, but there are combinations thereof that do exist.
Well, I will say this: I assume they're rare for a reason. It's pretty challenging to do all those different disciplines, I would imagine, for one individual. So,
I would agree, and I'm not a fan of them. But at any rate, with fire and EMS, there's an absolute purpose and a time where they should be combined. But then there's also an appropriate time, I believe, where they should be separated. And there's a multiple factors that come into it. The community, the population, the coverage, the call distribution, so many factors. So there's not a steadfast. It's got to be this way or the
well,
other.
let's unpack that then, Tim. Because okay,
Yeah.
so if you have, say, for example, if you are listening to this podcast, you're a city manager or you're a local elected official, you're a citizen, and you're having an ongoing issue with fire EMS service in your community for whatever reason, when does it become more beneficial, or what sort of factors come into play when you're determining whether or not you want to merge from a standalone to a combined, or do the reverse?
Yeah, and so I would say, and it's somewhat anecdotal, but I think I could back it up at least. It is smaller communities. So like once you start hitting like a coverage area of a population of, let's say, 10,000 people. 10,000 people is going to equate to roughly 1,000 EMS calls. Throw in there probably like 110 fire calls. So let's say 1,200 calls a year, roughly 3 to 4 calls or incidents per day that occur. That's where there's like this unique little sweet spot where fire and EMS together can successfully coexist because you're transitioning toward full-time staffing. You still need this paid on call or volunteer complement to be there, but there's like justification for this full-time staffing to exist. The community or the area in itself cannot justify full-time coverage for fire, but it could for EMS. So by integrating in and hiring firefighter EMTs, firefighter paramedics, it creates this little sweet spot of a zone where it becomes an efficiency model for communities. And especially when you start looking at like FLSA being the biggest curveball or factor in here, EMS workers, standalone EMS only, so EMTs, paramedics, are stuck on a 40-hour traditional work week as far as FLSA goes. Fire departments, firefighters, however, public firefighters, I should say, private could be different rules. Public firefighters fall under a different exemption that allows for a 53-hour work week. And so when someone like myself is trying to figure out how do we staff, how do we design, how do we model this out, a 24-hour shift is very common in these areas. And what that does is it when you break things out into either a three platoon or a three rotation or a four rotation model, a three platoon model, for instance, A, B, and C shift, let's call it, that breaks out to a 56-hour work week. So up to 53 hours of that is regular time. 3 hours of that would be overtime. And there's some creativity you can get in there with what's called a Kelly day. Too much detail, but within that model, at least, now you can have three shifts that are running, and you're paying on this 56-hour essential work week. On a four platoon model, that breaks down to a 42-hour work week. So with EMS workers, only EMS employees who are, have to follow the 40-hour work week rule, that's only 2 hours of overtime. So it's doable in that sense. And when you look at like the pay parity and breakout, it creates an equal playing field. And where I see things get messy is when, like, I was a part of an EMS agency where we had the three platoon 56-hour work week, but again, our EMTs and paramedics got paid on a 40-hour work week straight time, schedule. When someone was working a 24-hour shift versus a 12-hour shift or on a different type of rotation, one person, their hourly rate compared to the other person was vastly different. Their
Right.
gross salary at the end of the year might have been the same, but their hourly rate was vastly different. So when this person took overtime compared to that person, they're making a killing compared to the other one. And it creates animosity and whatnot. And so when there's separation of fire and EMS, that can exist. However, for these smaller communities that are transitioning into full-time coverage, utilizing that fire model allows you to at least take advantage of the 56-hour work weeks. Now they're working 56 hours, so you should by nature pay them more than the person working 40 hours because you worked more hours, even with sleep and whatever. But it's a fair and it's a safe area and it's a good transition point. So I would say once you start hitting 10,000 and even 8,000, whatever, but like once you start hitting a coverage area or a coverage population of 10,000, that's a really good sweet spot to start looking at fire and EMS combined. And I think that model can follow all the way through, until you start hitting like 150 or even 100 and something population, 100,000 population, 150,000. Once you start hitting that number, things are different. The call volume, the demand is higher, and what gets complicated is the peak volume of things. So 150,000 population, ballpark of 15,000 EMS calls a year, going to have roughly 1,500 fire calls a year. So now you got an organization running 16, 17,000 calls. The dynamics get really different where daytime volume is traditionally higher, sometimes a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio of daytime volume. So of those 17,000 calls, majority of those calls, two-thirds of the calls, so 6,000, so 12,000 of the 17,000 calls roughly are going to be during the hours of 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. versus overnight. So therefore, where you might be statistically okay with getting by with 6 ambulances 24/7, you could really justify 8 during the day. You can't justify 8 24 hours at a time, but you could justify 8 during the day, as an example. And so that's where it gets complicated because now you're going to start switching up 24-hour people and 12-hour people, and you're going to create this divide within the department, and it gets really weird. I am starting to see some fire departments who are integrating in non-fire people, so EMS, EMT, and paramedic only providers. And even there, it gets really, really muddy because now again, you're on a different FLSA schedule with them. And because they're not a firefighter, just by that very nature, the cultural difference that exists within those departments is very, very unique and not always successful.
Right.
And I'm speaking in generalities, but it really changes the ball game up significantly. And that's recruitment, that's retention, that's career advancement. It really gets muddied. So in those situations, you're almost better because the volume is there to handle fire separately, to handle EMS separately. You're almost at that point where you could take them apart and make them separate, truly separate.
So could kind of summarize this a little bit then. If you are in a community that is around that 10,000 resident mark, and obviously
Hmm.
you're using some back of the napkin sort of anecdotal numbers, what have you, because every community can have might have some anomalies. Whether or not
Yeah.
some community with 10,000 people might have for whatever reason a very high call volume. But you're saying is in generally speaking around that 10,000 population mark, that's when it really starts to make sense to look at, okay, do you want to bring in this volunteer sort of fire department in with an EMS department, combine them and make it create a win-win for the community with some efficiencies and economies of scale and what have you, right? And then as you fast forward to say a population of around 150,000, and again, this is a crude number because a lot of it is based off the actual what's your true call volume and how is that call volume distributed across a 24-hour window of time. But when you get to that 150,000 population mark, maybe that's when you really want to start exploring whether or not being separate makes the most sense in that case.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting baseline of where the optimization starts to come into play. And not only that, but the safety factor. You start getting above that 150,000 population and you have ambulances working 24-hour shifts. Unless you have enough of them, the workload may be too high to where a 24-hour shift may not be safe. Whereas a 12-hour shift and having, truly awake crews at night could be safer. But you tell any career fire department that you're going to transition people to 12 hours, 99.9% of them are going to call you a lot of different
Yeah, you're
words.
gonna have a mutiny on your hands, right?
Yeah, and so you can't touch that. In that sense, then separation may be appropriate. And what I see is a unique concept, and I see this more in the Carolinas and it's part of Florida as well, is an emergency services model. And I see this at like county government. In the Carolinas and Florida, I saw it, emergency services department at the county level, where there was fire services underneath it, usually just inspection and stuff because the fire departments were run by the cities, a countywide ambulance service, and then dispatch and animal control and some other stuff put in there. But the concept of emergency services, because fire departments will at least jokingly say that we're technically we're EMS departments that occasionally run fire. We're
Right,
not fire
right.
departments that occasionally run EMS. So what I'm trying to at least push a little bit is this idea of let's create this emergency services department. And like in Texas, they have emergency service districts, taxing districts. It makes sense. So have this emergency services department where it follows the same traditional structure of fire departments. There's this chief, but then from there you break it out into we're all wearing the same patch, we're all coming from the same funding, and we get paid and whatever equally together. But there's this EMS side and there's this fire side, and there's allowance for separation, but then there's also healthy allowance for people to be both, because some people on the EMS side do not want to be firefighters and vice versa.
Right.
So allow that to happen, increase your pool of applicants, and safely allow that to happen while still having the same reporting structure and building the same culture. Because when you try to mix EMS only people with fire only people, I have not seen it work yet. And if anyone can prove me wrong, please do, because I would love to hear about it and see it. I have not seen it work yet culturally, where EMS is not the redheaded stepchild in the organization, and even to the point where EMS gets the closet. It used to be the closet, and they just put a sofa in there so the EMS crew can be there while they're living within the fire department and renting. That is the common, worst case, but it's the common relationship that's there. Whereas this emergency services model really shows that you are part of the organization and there's lateral opportunities to move. There's this growth, and it starts from the get-go, this cultural standpoint of we are one. And if you don't want to be one, well, then don't come to work here. But it sets it from the start.
That's a great point, Tim. I think it's a great way to wrap up this episode because not only are we talking about the different operational models from an efficiency standpoint, you just can't look through the prism of efficiency. You got to look through the cultural ramifications of it and what impact it has on the organization as a whole, whether or not you're blending these departments or separating them. So, on that note, I think we'll call it a day for this first part of our episode. We're doing this little primer on fire EMS service so people can be a little bit more aware of what's going on in their communities and that we can educate educate folks and have a little bit more of a baseline understanding or knowledge about the challenges and dynamics that your city manager and your local elected officials are facing when it comes to balancing these pressing challenges, right, of limited resources and increasing demands on the services of these departments by our residents. So on that note, Tim, we'll call it a day. Before we eject out of this episode, do you have any final parting comments, and do you want to give the folks who are listening a good way of contacting you or reaching out to you?
Yeah, to part with this conversation, I would say, good God, just ask questions, contact me. Let's talk about this. Let me help you just fill in some of the blanks. There are so many moving parts, but there's so much opportunity that's there, especially if you're already in a state of conflict, then there's avenues to go. So just talk to me. Don't try to figure this out on your own. I really encourage just talk to me and follow along. So I would say if you're not following me on LinkedIn, shameless plug there, connect with me. And Tim Nowak, find me there, or I think it's Tim Nowak EMS, I think is my contact part for it. Find me there and just follow along with the conversations and see what people are saying, see how they're voting in the polls I have, and get that extra insight. And then PM me, reach out. We can go from there. I'm glad to talk with anyone and just see where the conversation goes. No hassle, no pressure. Let's just talk this stuff out. I want to equip you with as much information as I possibly can.
Excellent. And, I'll repeat once again, Tim is not just a consultant. He's not an academic. He was an actual practitioner. So he's been boots on the ground working in this environment. So he has the 360 comprehensive understanding of this whole issue. And there's none better in the biz. So if you have any questions about your fire EMS, please reach out to Tim, give him a holler, and I'm sure he'll put you on the right path. Thanks again, Tim. I'm Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. Thank you once again for listening. If you like the program, please hit that follow, subscribe button, and don't forget to leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, or whatever platform you listen to the program on. We'll catch you next time in part 2 of our interview series with Tim as we go through the fire EMS service and lay the groundwork for better understanding by the public and local elected officials. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.